You hear this word a lot in photography, but when someone is talking about exposure and they say a stop, what does that mean? Stick around to find out. Greetings, carbon-based YouTubers, and welcome to Pro Photo Tips. My name is Josh Cripps, and you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Joshua Cripps Photography. Now, if you've been confused by stops when you're out taking pictures, don't worry, you're not the only one. The word stop appears in two main places in photography. One is when you're talking about f-stops, and the other is when you're talking about stops of light. The first use, f-stop, has to do entirely with aperture, and I talk about that in a separate lesson. In this video, we're going to be talking exclusively about stops of light. In a very basic sense, a stop is a measure of how bright your photo is. Just like I can say, this tree is about 70 feet away from me, and those other trees are another 70 feet past that, I can say, well, this photo is a stop brighter than this one, and this photo is a stop brighter still. But what does that mean? How much is a stop? Well, here's where things get really interesting, because unlike a foot, which is a constant amount, a stop is not a constant measure. Rather, it's a relative measure that tells you the difference in brightness between two things. So while I can't say this photo is 2 stops bright, I can say this photo is 2 stops brighter than this photo. So what's the value of a stop? Well, whenever you increase or reduce the amount of light you're dealing with by a factor of 2, that is 1 stop. In other words, if you increase the exposure of your photo by 1 stop, you've made it twice as bright. Or an even better way to think about it, you've let in twice as much light into your camera. And the converse is true as well. If you decrease your exposure by 1 stop, you're letting in half as much light. Now, here's how all of this relates to actually taking photos. Say you're out, you've got your camera set up with what you think are pretty good settings, but your photos are all coming out a little bit too dark. Well, you can try increasing your exposure by 1 stop to see if you get a better result. We know that increasing exposure by a stop is the same as letting twice as much light into your camera. And a really easy way to do that is to double your shutter speed, right? Because if your shutter speed is open twice as long, it lets twice as much light in. Say you've got a shutter speed of 1 second, well, doubling it to 2 seconds has the effect of increasing your exposure by exactly 1 stop. Now, what if you needed to increase your exposure by another stop? All you'd have to do is double your shutter speed again, this time from 2 seconds to 4 seconds. If you needed another stop, we'd double it from 4 to 8 seconds, then to 16 seconds, and so on. Even though the change in shutter speed gets longer each time, because we're doubling it, they all represent a difference of 1 stop. Let's go back to the original shutter speed of 1 second. Say the photo was too bright and we wanted to reduce the exposure by 1 stop. Well, then we'd want to let half as much light into the camera, so we'd cut our shutter speed in half from 1 second to half a second. Another stop down would be 1/4 second, then 1/8 of a second, and so on. Of course, you notice that my example photos got either way too bright or way too dark. And actually, that's okay, because it turns out that you can adjust your exposure with either your aperture or your ISO in order to compensate for that. So be sure to check out part 2 of this video, where you'll learn how aperture and ISO fit in with stops. Then in part 3, we'll learn about all of the crazy, cool, creative things you can do when you adjust all those settings independently, and how you can use your knowledge of stops to balance your exposure. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends and subscribe to the channel. You can also join our newsletter for heaps more photo tips and tutorials. Until next time, have fun and happy shooting.